December 22nd, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Private First Class Robert Hammond lay wounded in a frozen foxhole, 3 miles behind enemy lines. German artillery had shredded his company. The temperature had plummeted to -10 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow drifts reached 4 feet deep in some places. His squad leader knelt beside him, grimacing. "Medics can't get through, Hammond. Jeeps are stuck. Trucks can't make it up these hills. Even the tanks are sliding off the roads." Hammond looked at the dense forest, the impossible snow, the steep terrain. He figured he had maybe 6 hours before hypothermia or blood loss finished what the German shells had started. Then he heard it. A strange mechanical growl, different from any vehicle he'd ever heard. High-pitched, almost insect-like. Through the trees emerged something that looked like it had crawled out of a fever dream. A low, tracked vehicle no bigger than a jeep, painted winter white, gliding across the 4-foot snow drifts like they were a paved highway. On the back, 2 medics rode with stretchers secured to modified racks. Hammond would later write home, "I thought I was hallucinating. This little tracked box came sliding through snow that buried our jeeps up to their windshields. The Germans didn't know what hit them. Hell, we didn't know we had them. Germans never knew American Weasels could carry stretchers through 4 feet of snow." What Private Hammond witnessed was one of America's most underappreciated weapons of World War II, the M29 Weasel. A vehicle so unusual, so specialized, and so effective that it changed winter warfare forever. The Germans never expected it. And by the time they realized what American logistics could accomplish in the worst terrain imaginable, the Battle of the Bulge and the war had already turned against them. This is the story of the little tracked vehicle that saved thousands of American lives and proved that American ingenuity could overcome even Hitler's desperate winter. Gamble. To understand why the M29 Weasel became so critical, we need to understand just how catastrophic the terrain and weather conditions were during the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, Hitler launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, his last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. He chose the Ardennes Forest for good reason. The Ardennes is 11,000 square miles of dense forest, steep hills, narrow roads, and river valleys. In peacetime, it's challenging terrain. In December 1944, it became hell on earth. The winter of 1944–45 was one of the coldest in recorded European history. Temperatures in the Ardennes dropped to between -10 and -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow fell continuously, accumulating to depths of 3 to 4 feet in open areas, and forming massive drifts of 6 to 8 feet in valleys and along forest edges. American forces had prepared for a quiet sector. The Ardennes had been considered a rest area, where divisions could recover from brutal fighting elsewhere. New units came here to acclimate to combat. Veteran units came here to lick their wounds. Nobody expected a major German offensive, and absolutely nobody was prepared for the logistical nightmare that followed. Within the first 48 hours of the German attack, American supply lines collapsed. Standard jeeps, the backbone of American mobility, immediately became useless. Their 6.5 inches of ground clearance meant that in snow deeper than 1 foot, they simply plowed forward until their chassis bottomed out, wheels spinning uselessly. Technical Sergeant James Morrison, 28th Infantry Division, later recalled, "We tried pushing jeeps through 2-foot snow for about an hour before we gave up. It was like trying to drive through concrete. The wheels just dug holes. We couldn't even tow them out because the tow vehicles got stuck trying to reach them." The situation with trucks was even worse. The standard GMC CCKW 2.5-ton cargo truck, the deuce and a half, that had carried American supplies from Normandy to the German border, had 10 inches of ground clearance. In theory, this should have handled moderate snow. In practice, the narrow tires, heavy weight, and underpowered engines meant that these trucks were completely immobilized by snow deeper than 18 inches on flat ground. On the steep, winding roads of the Ardennes, Forget it. Captain Harold Williams, Quartermaster Corps. We had trucks jackknife it across every road. Drivers trying to navigate the hills would lose traction, slide sideways, and block the entire route. Then snow would pile up around them. Within 6 hours, what had been a supply route became a parking lot of frozen metal. But the real crisis wasn't just supplies. It was casualties. In the first week of the Battle of the Bulge, American forces suffered approximately 19,000 casualties. Thousands of wounded men lay in frozen foxholes, aid stations cut off from evacuation routes, and field hospitals that couldn't be resupplied. In normal conditions, the medical evacuation chain worked efficiently. Medics would stabilize wounded soldiers in the field, stretcher bearers would carry them to collection points, ambulances would transport them to aid stations, and from there they'd move to field hospitals and eventually to rear area facilities. This entire system depended on vehicles. During the Normandy campaign, the average time from wounding to surgical treatment was 4 to 6 hours. This fast evacuation time was a major factor in the American survival rate. Approximately 96% of wounded American soldiers who reached medical treatment survived their injuries. In the Ardennes in December 1944, that evacuation time stretched to 12, 24, even 48 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Delaney, medical officer with the 106th Infantry Division. We had wounded men dying of treatable injuries because we couldn't get them out. Guys with arterial wounds that could be repaired, chest wounds that needed drainage, compound fractures that needed surgery. They'd survive the initial trauma, stabilize at the aid station, and then die of shock and hypothermia because the ambulances couldn't reach them and we couldn't keep them warm. Medics improvised desperately. They tried using sleds pulled by soldiers, exhausting work that took 4 men to move one casualty a few hundred yards. They tried having wounded men walk if they could, but men with leg wounds, chest trauma, or serious blood loss couldn't walk 3 miles through snow. Some units tried using horses and mules captured from German supply columns. But horses struggled in the deep snow almost as badly as vehicles, and feeding them in a supply crisis was impossible. The German plan was working perfectly. By attacking in winter, through terrain where American mechanization became a liability instead of an advantage, they had neutralized one of America's greatest strengths. But there was one vehicle the Germans didn't know about. A strange little tracked machine that had been designed for an entirely different environment, shipped to Europe almost as an afterthought, and was about to prove that American logistics could adapt to anything. The birth of the Weasel. The story of the M29 Weasel begins not in the forests of Belgium, but in the frozen wastes of Norway, and in the creative mind of an eccentric British inventor. In 1940, Geoffrey Pike was working for British Combined Operations, dreaming up unconventional solutions to unconventional problems. One of his wildest ideas was Project Plow, a plan to insert commando teams deep into German-occupied Norway to sabotage hydroelectric plants and disrupt German heavy water production. The problem? Norway in winter is one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Temperatures routinely drop below zero. Snow accumulates to depths of 10 to 15 feet in mountain passes. Standard vehicles are useless. Pike needed something that could carry commandos and their equipment through deep snow, across frozen lakes, and up mountain slopes. Something that could operate 200 miles behind enemy lines with no hope of resupply or rescue. He needed something that didn't exist. Pike approached the Americans with his problem. In 1942, the U.S. Army established a project office to develop what they initially called a cargo carrier, light, tracked. The challenge was immense. The vehicle needed to traverse snow 3 to 4 feet deep without bogging down, climb slopes of 35 to 40 degrees, carry a payload of 1,200 pounds plus a driver, be light enough that it wouldn't break through ice or snow bridges, be simple enough that soldiers with minimal training could operate and repair it, be cheap enough to mass produce. The Army turned to the Studebaker Corporation, which had been building Weasel prototypes since early 1943. The T-15, as the prototype was designated, was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of trying to power through snow like a conventional vehicle, it was designed to float on top of it. The secret was ground pressure, the vehicle's weight distributed over its track contact area. A standard Jeep exerted about 20 pounds per square inch of ground pressure. This meant it would sink into snow until it hit solid ground or got stuck. The T-15 exerted only 1.8 pounds per square inch less pressure than a human footprint. The tracks themselves were innovative. Rather than steel tracks like a tank, the Weasel used rubber tracks with metal crossbars for grip. These tracks were 20 inches wide and ran the entire length of the vehicle, providing maximum flotation. The suspension used a series of small bogie wheels that allowed the tracks to conform to rough terrain. When the Weasel encountered an obstacle, a log, a rock, a ridge of ice, the flexible track would simply flow over it rather than trying to push through it. Power came from a Studebaker Champion 6-cylinder engine, basically a commercial truck engine. It produced only 70 horsepower, but the vehicle weighed just 4,300 pounds fully loaded. This gave it a power-to-weight ratio that would let it climb slopes that would stop heavier vehicles. Testing began in late 1943 at military facilities in Montana, Michigan, and Colorado, anywhere they could find deep snow and brutal conditions. The results were remarkable. In tests at Fort Ethan Allen, Vermont, the T-15 traversed 40-inch deep snow at speeds of 15 to 20 miles per hour. Jeeps attempting the same course made it approximately 30 feet before becoming immobilized. At the Badger Ordnance Works in Wisconsin, engineers drove a T-15 across Lake Michigan ice covered with 30 inches of powder snow. The vehicle left barely a trace. The tracks distributed weight so effectively that they didn't even pack the snow down significantly. Climbing tests showed the T-15 could ascend 36-degree slopes in deep snow, grades that would cause conventional vehicles to lose traction and slide backward. But the most impressive test involved water. The Weasel wasn't designed to be amphibious, but its low weight and large track surface area meant that it could swim, sort of. With careful operation, a Weasel could paddle across calm water at about 4 miles per hour, propelled by the action of its tracks. More importantly, it could break through ice that would stop other vehicles and then crawl out the other side. If a Weasel broke through a snow bridge over a stream, the driver could simply drive along the streambed and climb up the far bank. This resilience was exactly what the military needed. In May 1944, the T-15 was standardized as the M29 cargo carrier, tracked Weasel. The nickname Weasel came from its ability to go anywhere and squeeze through tight spaces, though some soldiers claimed it was because of the high-pitched sound of its engine. Studebaker began mass production. The initial order was for 2,000 units. But there was a problem. By mid-1944, Operation Plow, the Norwegian commando mission, had been cancelled. The war had moved on. The Allies were pushing through France toward Germany. Why did they need a specialized snow vehicle? The initial batches of M29s sat in depots, largely unused. Some were sent to Italy for mountain warfare. A few went to units training for winter operations. But most were considered specialized equipment for niche situations. Then came December 16, 1944, and suddenly, every commander in the Ardennes was screaming for Weasels. Weasels to the rescue. By December 20, 1944, 4 days into the German offensive, the supply crisis in the Ardennes had reached critical levels. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded at Bastogne, 18,000 men with dwindling ammunition and medical supplies. The 82nd Airborne was fighting desperately to hold the northern shoulder of the German penetration. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions were trying to blunt the German spearheads but were running low on fuel and ammunition. And thousands of wounded Americans lay scattered across hundreds of square miles of frozen forest, with no way to reach them. Emergency orders went out. Find every M29 Weasel in the European theater and get them to the Ardennes immediately. The response was frantic. Weasels were pulled from training units in England. They were diverted from ships that had just docked. Maintenance depots in France were ordered to get non-operational Weasels running within 24 hours. By December 22nd, approximately 80 M29 Weasels had reached the Ardennes. By Christmas Day, that number had grown to over 150. It wasn't nearly enough for the entire front, but where they were deployed, they performed miracles. The first combat use of Weasels in the Bulge was improvised, desperate, and wildly successful. On December 21st, a medical clearing station near Malmedy was cut off with 47 wounded men. The roads were blocked by destroyed vehicles and 4 feet of snow. German patrols were active in the area. The wounded couldn't walk, and the medics couldn't carry them. A sergeant in the motor pool remembered seeing some weird little track things arrive the night before. He found 2 M29s, neither with a driver trained on the vehicle. "Can you drive it?" the medical officer asked. "Hell, I can drive anything," the sergeant replied. They loaded 6 wounded men and their gear into the 2 Weasels, 3 men per vehicle, lying on stretchers that they lashed to the cargo area. The sergeant and a corporal who'd driven a tractor before the war climbed into the driver's seats. The route to the rear aid station was 3 miles through dense forest and German-infiltrated territory. In a jeep, it would have been impossible. In a Weasel, it was merely terrifying. The sergeant later described the experience. "That thing went where nothing else could. We drove straight through snowdrifts that would have buried a jeep. Went up hills I wouldn't have tried in summer. One time we hit a log under the snow. The whole vehicle just rocked up and over it like it was nothing. The Germans fired at us a couple times, but we were moving through the trees and they couldn't get a good shot. Plus, I don't think they knew what the hell we were. Probably thought we were some kind of miniature tank." The 2 Weasels made the 3-mile journey in 35 minutes, a trip that would have taken hours on foot, if it was possible at all. All 6 wounded men survived. The medical officer immediately radioed for more Weasels. Within days, an informal medical evacuation system had developed around the M29s. Forward aid stations would radio their location and number of wounded. Weasel drivers, now a prized specialty, would plot routes that avoided roads, where German ambushes and abandoned vehicles blocked movement, and instead cut cross-country through forest, across fields, and even directly over frozen streams. The standard load was 3 to 4 wounded men, depending on the severity of their injuries. Stretchers were secured to brackets that enterprising mechanics had welded onto the cargo area. In extreme cold, medics would pile blankets and heating packs around the casualties. The numbers tell the story. In the last 2 weeks of December 1944, M29 Weasels evacuated over 2,400 wounded American soldiers from positions that would have been unreachable by conventional vehicles. The survival rate for wounded soldiers evacuated by Weasel was 94%, only slightly lower than the normal evacuation rate, despite the much longer times and worse conditions. Captain Robert Hendricks, medical officer, 30th Infantry Division. The Weasel saved more American lives in the Bulge than any other single piece of equipment. These were guys who would have died in foxholes. They'd already survived the initial wound, they'd been stabilized by medics, but they needed surgery and they needed it fast. The Weasels got them there. But medical evacuation was only one mission. The M29 also became critical for resupplying isolated units. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne received supply drops by parachute, but those supplies had to be collected, sorted, and distributed to fighting positions around the perimeter. With roads blocked and German fire making daytime movement suicidal, Weasels became the primary distribution system. At night, Weasels would crawl through the forest from the drop zones to the forward foxholes, carrying ammunition, medical supplies, food, and winter clothing. Their small size and quiet engines, compared to trucks, made them hard to detect. Their tracks left minimal traces in the snow. Sergeant Donald Pierce, 101st Airborne. We'd be sitting in our holes, freezing our asses off, almost out of ammo, and then we'd hear that high-pitched whine. This little white track thing would come sliding up through the trees, and guys would unload boxes of ammunition and K-rations like it was Christmas morning. Which, hell, sometimes it was literally Christmas morning. The psychological impact was enormous. Surrounded troops who could receive supplies and evacuate their wounded maintained their fighting spirit. Units knew that they weren't abandoned, that American logistics could reach them even in the worst conditions imaginable. The Germans were baffled. German intelligence officers interrogating captured American soldiers asked repeatedly about the small tracked supply vehicles. They couldn't understand how the Americans were maintaining supply lines through terrain where German logistics were failing. One German after-action report from the 5th Panzer Army noted, American forces demonstrate previously unknown tracked vehicles capable of cross-country movement in deep snow. These vehicles appear to operate independently of road networks and have been observed in terrain considered impassable. Their presence indicates American logistical capabilities exceed previous estimates. The German army had nothing comparable. Their logistics depended on trucks and horse-drawn wagons, both of which were struggling in the snow. German supply lines stretched back to the German border, and every mile became more difficult as snow accumulated and Allied air power, when weather cleared, hammered the roads. Meanwhile, American Weasels were delivering supplies to the front line through forests and across country that the Germans couldn't traverse. Beyond the Bulge, the success of the M29 Weasel in the Ardennes led to an immediate expansion of its use across the European theater. As Allied forces pushed into Germany in early 1945, winter conditions continued to hamper operations. The Weasel became a standard piece of equipment for units operating in mountains, forests, or anywhere conventional vehicles struggled. In Italy, the war had stalled in the Apennine Mountains. Allied forces were trying to break through German defensive lines in some of the most rugged terrain in Europe. Mountain infantry units received Weasels specifically for supply missions. The narrow mountain tracks and steep grades that made truck convoy impossible were perfect Weasel territory. Lieutenant Frank Morrison, 10th Mountain Division. We'd climb all day to take a ridge, and by the time we got there, we'd be down to our last clips of ammunition and out of water. The Weasels would come up trails that mountain goats would think twice about. Fully loaded, carrying ammo and water cans, grinding up grades that had to be 40 degrees. The Germans up in their positions would watch these things crawl up the mountain, and you could tell they couldn't figure out how we were doing it. They'd been fighting in Italy for 2 years, and they knew vehicle supply was impossible in the mountains. Except suddenly, it wasn't. In March 1945, when Allied forces crossed the Rhine River, M29 Weasels played a crucial role in the initial bridgehead operations. The riverbanks on the eastern side of the Rhine were muddy, steep, and churned into a quagmire by artillery fire and spring thaw. Heavy vehicles bogged down. Supply trucks couldn't reach the forward units fighting to expand the bridgehead. Weasels could. Their low ground pressure meant they could traverse mud that swallowed jeeps. They could climb the steep riverbanks. And critically, they were small enough to cross on the early pontoon bridges that couldn't support heavier traffic. Based on experience in the Bulge, several field modifications became standard. Armored cabs. Some units added thin armor plates around the driver's position to protect against small arms fire and shrapnel. This wasn't factory standard, but welding shops at maintenance depots would add it on request. Stretcher racks. The improvised mounting systems for stretchers became standardized. By January 1945, Weasels designated for medical evacuation came with purpose-built brackets that could secure up to 4 stretchers. Weapon mounts. Some units mounted .30 or .50 caliber machine guns on pedestal mounts, turning the Weasel into a highly mobile fire support vehicle, though this was controversial since it made the vehicles legitimate combat targets under Geneva Convention rules if they were also being used for medical evacuation. Communications. Radio sets became standard equipment, allowing Weasel drivers to coordinate with forward units and receive updated casualty information or supply requests. The Army dramatically increased Weasel production. The initial order of 2,000 units was expanded to over 15,000 by war's end. Studebaker plants in Indiana ran 24-hour shifts. The M29C, an improved amphibious version with enhanced flotation, entered production in early 1945. Weasels were shipped not just to Europe but to the Pacific Theater, where they proved valuable in New Guinea and the Philippines for traversing swamps and jungle terrain. Other nations, the British and Canadian armies, seeing American success with the Weasel, requested their own allocations. By spring 1945, Commonwealth forces in Northwest Europe had received several hundred M29s. The Soviets, always interested in Allied equipment, received a small number of Weasels through Lend-Lease. Soviet engineers studied the design carefully. After the war, they developed their own tracked cargo carriers based partly on the M29 concept. From a logistics perspective, the M29 was remarkably efficient. Each Weasel cost approximately $5,600 to produce, about twice the cost of a Jeep, but a fraction of the cost of a half-track or armored vehicle. Fuel consumption was modest, about 6 to 8 miles per gallon, comparable to a Jeep. Maintenance was simple. The vehicle used many commercial truck components that were readily available. But the capability multiplier was enormous. A single Weasel could deliver supplies or evacuate wounded from positions that would otherwise require 10 to 20 men as stretcher bearers or supply carriers, multiple hours or even days of effort, exposure of soldiers to enemy fire during movement, risk of soldiers becoming casualties themselves. One Army logistics study estimated that each Weasel operating in the Ardennes during January-February 1945 saved an average of 8 to 12 American lives through medical evacuation, while also reducing the manpower required for supply operations by approximately 40 personnel. The soldiers who depended on Weasels developed a deep affection for the ungainly little vehicles. Private Harold Zimmerman, 99th Infantry Division, wounded near Elsenborn Ridge. I caught shrapnel in my legs and couldn't walk. I thought I was done for. It was 20 below, snowing, and I was 3 miles from the aid station. Then this crazy track thing comes whining up through the trees. Driver jumps out. Him and a medic load me in the back, pile blankets on me, and we're off. That thing bounced and jolted like a mechanical bull. But 40 minutes later, I'm in a field hospital getting surgery. I never even knew what it was called until later. Somebody told me it was a Weasel. Perfect name. Sneaky, tough little bastard. I loved that vehicle more than my own mother right then. Weasel drivers became informal celebrities in their units. Corporal Eddie Kowalski, 3rd Armored Division. Guys would cheer when they saw you coming. I'd be grinding up some hill with a load of ammo, and soldiers in foxholes would wave and yell. It was like being a goddamn hero, and all I was doing was driving a box with tracks. The best part was knowing you were making a difference. Every supply run meant guys had the bullets they needed. Every wounded man you brought back was a life saved. You felt it, you know? Like what you were doing mattered. The innovation edge. The success of the M29 Weasel in World War II illustrates several key advantages that American forces possessed, advantages that went far beyond simple industrial capacity. The Weasel story demonstrates American military adaptability at its finest. The vehicle was designed for a mission, Norwegian commando raids, that never happened. When that mission was canceled, lesser militaries might have simply scrapped the project or left the vehicles in storage. Instead, when conditions in the Ardennes created an urgent need, the American military identified an available solution, deployed it within days, and adapted it to new missions it was never designed for. This kind of institutional flexibility was a key American advantage throughout the war. The U.S. military wasn't just big, it was responsive. New equipment could be requisitioned, tested, modified, and deployed faster than in any other military system. The Germans launched the Battle of the Bulge partly because they believed American supply lines would collapse in winter conditions. They were counting on it. German planning documents specifically noted that American mechanization would become a liability in deep snow and rough terrain. Cut off American supplies, German commanders reasoned, and American units would lose their fighting effectiveness. They were wrong. The introduction of the Weasel, along with other measures like air supply drops, improved winter equipment, and simply the relentless grinding efficiency of American logistics, meant that American forces maintained combat effectiveness even under the worst conditions. This shocked German commanders. They had fought the Russians on the Eastern Front, where winter regularly shut down operations. They expected the same in the Ardennes. Instead, they faced an enemy who could supply frontline troops through 4 feet of snow, evacuate wounded from surrounded positions, and maintain operational tempo despite weather that should have frozen everything to a standstill. General Otto von Manschenfeld, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, later wrote, "We calculated that American supply difficulties would give us at least 4 days to exploit our breakthrough before their lines could stabilize. Instead, American logistics proved far more resilient than anticipated. Their ability to maintain supply even in extreme conditions was unlike anything we had experienced on the Eastern Front." The M29 Weasel also reflects a distinctly American approach to military engineering: practical, simple, and scalable. Compare the Weasel to German tracked vehicles. German half-tracks and armored vehicles were often over-engineered, complex, requiring specialized parts and skilled maintenance, expensive to produce. The Weasel used a commercial truck engine, simple rubber tracks, and basic mechanical components. A motor pool mechanic with standard tools could repair one. Parts were interchangeable with civilian vehicles. This design for mass production philosophy meant that when the Army needed 15,000 Weasels, Studebaker could build them. When units needed repairs, they could do them in field maintenance shops. When improvements were needed, they could be implemented quickly. German forces often had superior individual weapons or vehicles, but they couldn't produce them in quantities that mattered, and they couldn't keep them running in the field. American equipment might not have been the absolute best in every category, but it was good enough, available in huge quantities, and could be maintained under field conditions. In war, that combination wins. There's another element to the Weasel story that often gets overlooked. The Americans cared about casualty evacuation. The U.S. military invested enormous resources in saving wounded soldiers' lives. Medical supplies were prioritized for transport. Field hospitals were well equipped. Evacuation systems were designed to get wounded men to surgical treatment as fast as possible. This wasn't just humanitarian, it was strategic. Soldiers who knew they would receive excellent medical care if wounded fought with more confidence and aggression. Units with low casualty rates maintained morale and cohesion. Men who recovered from wounds and returned to duty represented a training investment preserved. The Germans, by contrast, often left wounded soldiers in field conditions with minimal care. Soviet forces frequently had even worse medical support. Japanese forces in the Pacific often provided virtually no medical evacuation for wounded soldiers. The M29 Weasel, designed for cargo carrying but immediately adapted for medical evacuation, represents this American emphasis on preserving soldier lives. It wasn't designed as an ambulance, but when wounded men needed evacuation through impossible terrain, the American military found a way. The Weasel wasn't a war-winning weapon in the sense of a fighter plane or battleship. It didn't destroy German divisions or sink Japanese carriers, but it saved thousands of American lives, kept surrounded units supplied. It maintained logistical flow under conditions where logistics should have been impossible. And it sent a message to the enemy. American military power wasn't just about tanks and bombers. It was about a complete system, industrial, logistical, medical, adaptive, that could respond to any challenge and overcome any obstacle. When German soldiers saw American Weasels crawling through snow drifts that stopped their own supply wagons, when they watched supplies reaching American positions that should have been cut off, they realized they weren't just fighting an army. They were fighting a machine, a system, an industrial and logistical apparatus that could adapt, improvise, and overcome faster than they could react. After the Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, when German forces retreated to their original start lines. The offensive had failed catastrophically. Germany lost 100,000 men, 600 tanks and assault guns, and irreplaceable fuel reserves. American casualties were heavy, approximately 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, and 23,000 missing or captured. But the outcome was never in doubt after the first week. American logistics, despite the winter conditions and surprise attack, had kept fighting units supplied and operational. The M29 Weasel had played a small but vital role in that logistical triumph. After V-Day in May 1945, Weasels continued serving in occupation duty across Europe. They proved particularly valuable in areas where infrastructure had been destroyed by fighting, which was most of Germany by spring 1945. Engineers used Weasels to access remote work sites. Military government units used them to reach isolated villages. Supply units used them to distribute food and fuel to displaced persons' camps. In the Pacific Theater, Weasels saw limited but effective use in the Philippines campaign. They could traverse rice paddies and jungle terrain that bogged down conventional vehicles. However, the jungle environment wasn't ideal for the vehicles. Heat and humidity caused maintenance issues, and the narrow tracks were vulnerable to tropical rot. The M29 Weasel returned to combat in Korea, particularly during the brutal winter of 1950-51, when UN forces retreated from the Yalu River. In mountainous Korean terrain with limited roads and harsh winter conditions, the Weasel once again proved its value for medical evacuation and supply missions. However, by this time the vehicle was showing its age. The basic design was nearly a decade old. Replacement parts were becoming scarce. The military began developing improved tracked cargo carriers. The M-76 Otter, an amphibious successor to the Weasel, entered service in the early 1950s. It incorporated lessons learned from the M29 but with improved engines, better tracks, and enhanced amphibious capability. After World War II, surplus M29 Weasels found extensive civilian use. Forestry services snapped them up for fire suppression and survey work in remote areas. Mining companies used them in Alaska and northern Canada. Arctic explorers used modified Weasels for polar expeditions.